ゴジラだ。ゴジラが来たぞ。
尾形さん、あの子と芹沢さんに言いそびれちゃったの。
We need a hero. Someone to separate the man from the movie. Sounds like a job. Verbal dioramas. Watches all the movies from comedy to drama. From the top row sound. And don't forget the action. She'll watch until the end and then she'll give you her reaction. Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequels, sequels, remakes, and trivia and outtakes. Movies you know, movies you don't. Interesting stories, all the categories.
Hi everyone, I'm Em and welcome to Verbal Diorama episode 348, Godzilla. This is the podcast that's all about the history and legacy of movies you know and movies you don't. That's the Raymond Burr of this episode, in the background trying to explain the story to you in English. If that doesn't make sense, it soon will. Welcome to Verbal Diorama, whether you're a brand new listener, whether you're a regular returning listener, thank you so much for being here and thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast. I'm so happy to have you here for the history and legacy of Godzilla. And of course, if you are a regular returning listener, thank you so much to you because you continue to listen to and support this podcast. And you have been doing so for over the last 7 years and over 300 episodes now. So thank you so much for your continued support. It genuinely means so much, as I say, to an indie podcaster who does all of this all by herself and has done for the last 7 years. I'm always blown away by people's generosity and continued support. So thank you so much. And if you are a brand new listener, well, welcome to this podcast. And also, there's plenty for you to catch up on, so maybe eventually you will too become a regular returning listener. That would be amazing. It is June, and one of the things that I've always loved to do on this podcast is a Kaijun season. This is my third Kaijun season that I've done, so there's plenty of other Kaiju movie episodes on this podcast. But Kaijun is always a really popular month, not just for the listeners, but for me as well, because I am such a huge fan of monster movies, and I always have been. And so these are the sort of movies that I love to talk about the most. And in fact, this season, the first episode of Kaijun was on The Meg, which, who doesn't love a great big shark movie? And then the last episode was on the original King Kong from 1933. And of course, King Kong shaped cinema and inspired Godzilla in part. But Godzilla isn't just a monster movie. It didn't just birth the kaiju genre. It was a response to the grief and trauma of an entire nation and a stark warning to the rest of humanity. Here's the trailer for Godzilla.
ゴジラに光を当ててはいけません。ますます起こるばかりです。
100万年前に生息した開きの大怪獣ゴジラ。水爆実験はついに太平洋に眠る大怪獣の怒りを買った。放射能を発し白熱の海溝を吐きながらゴジラは東京へ上陸した。
僕は反対です。尾形、私は気まぐれに言ってるんではないよ。あのゴジラは世界中の学者が誰一人として見ていない日本だけに現れた貴重な研究知らず。
しかし先生、だからといってあの凶暴な怪物をあのままほっとくわけにはいきません。
君までがゴジラを抹殺しようというのか。
バカな、素人のあなた一人を海の中に放り込みますか。
俺が死なない限りどんなことで再び使用する立場に追い込まれないと誰が断言できる。
もしもそれが 恐ろしい目的に使用されたとしたら。
青年科学者芹沢が秘めた恐るべき発明とは。
長年の研究の成果を何ということなさるんです。話せ。
近代兵器を装備し続々と出動する陸海空の精鋭、ゴジラの恐怖から脱出する難民の群れ。
ただでさえうるさい国際問題が一体どうなるか。
あ、終わったか。頼むよ。はい。
制作費1億、6ヶ月の苦闘が生んだ世紀の不変ゴジラ。映画技術の粋を集め、大東宝が全能力を挙げた空前のスペクタクルゴジラ。本年最大の話題作ゴジラ。
When 17 vessels explode and sink near Odo Island, Professor Yamane, his daughter Emiko, and ship's captain Hiroto Ogata head to the island to investigate. Soon they witness a giant monster called Godzilla by the locals, destroying the spot. Meanwhile, Emiko meets her fiancé, the secluded scientist Serizawa, and he makes her promise to keep a secret about his newly developed oxygen destroyer, a biological device that would destroy all living things in the ocean. When Godzilla threatens Tokyo and other Japanese cities, and the army and navy are incapable of stopping the monster, Emiko divulges Serizawa's secret to her secret love Ogata. While her father wants to keep Godzilla alive, they have to convince Serizawa to use the oxygen destroyer to kill Godzilla, but he refuses to let his invention become the next big superweapon. Let's run through the cast. We have Akira Takarada as Hiroto Ogata, Momoko Kochi as Emiko Yamane, Akihiko Hirata as Dr. Serizawa, Takashi Shimura as Dr. Yamane, Fuyuki Murakami as Dr. Tanabe, Sashio Sakai as Hagiwara, and Haruo Nakajima and Katsumi Tezuka as Godzilla. Godzilla has a screenplay by Takeo Murata and Ishirō Honda, story by Shigeru Koyama, and was directed by Ishirō Honda. And as always, apologies for any butcherings of Japanese pronunciations. But when we think of Gojira or Godzilla, I'm going to use the term Godzilla in this episode rather than use Gojira or use the names interchangeably. But when we think of Godzilla, we think of either the larger-than-life blockbuster US MonsterVerse movies, which started with the American reboot of Godzilla in 2014, followed by Kong Skull Island in 2017. The two characters then clashed in Godzilla vs. Kong, a genuine fun time at the movies during the pandemic. But we also think of Toho's modern reboots, the Reiwa era of Godzilla, the bureaucracy-filled Shin Godzilla, which is episode 212 of this podcast, or the post-war PTSD epic Godzilla -1. Or, if you're me, you think of the 1998 Roland Emmerich Godzilla. The original 1954 film was never intended to be a fun monster movie. It was the trauma of a country laid out bare on screen, released a decade after one of Japan's biggest tragedies. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and 9th of August 1945, respectively. The aerial bombings, the only time nuclear weapons have been used in an armed conflict, killed between 129,000 and 226,000 people overall, most of them civilians. The UK gave their consent to the bombings of large urban areas with significant military facilities. For months afterwards, many people continued to die from the effects of burns, radiation sickness and injuries compounded by illness and malnutrition. There were plans for further attacks, but on the 15th of August, 6 days after the bombing of Nagasaki, Japan surrendered to the Allies. On the 2nd of September 1945, the Japanese leadership formally declared their country's surrender, bringing an end to the conflict. It was not the only time Allied forces bombed Japan, but it was the only time atomic bombs had been used. Japan's painful history with the atomic bomb gave them a unique perspective. As the only country to have ever been affected by nuclear weapons, their fears of the atomic bomb and how humanity deals with such a thing are what made Godzilla. The fears of a nation and the embodiment of a man-made creation that is unpredictable, unprecedented, and terrifying. Following Japan's surrender, the American occupation imposed strict censorship on Japanese filmmaking. Banned subjects included any depiction of feudal loyalty, samurai conflict, or material that could be read as nationalistic. Also forbidden, critically, was any direct reference to the atomic bombings or their aftermath. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were essentially off limits as subjects, which meant the nation's deepest wound couldn't be addressed directly on screen. This suppression didn't kill Japanese cinema, but it shaped it in lasting ways, pushing trauma underground. Despite, or arguably because of these constraints, the late 1940s and early 1950s produced some of the most celebrated Japanese films ever made. Akira Kurosawa emerged as a dominant force with Drunken Angel in 1948 and Stray Dog in 1949. They were gritty, noir-inflected films grappling with post-war dislocation. Rashomon in 1950 won the Golden Lion at Venice and the honorary Oscar, essentially introducing Japanese cinema to Western audiences for the first time. Ikiru followed in 1952, and Seven Samurai arrived the same year as Godzilla in 1954. But really, one of the main catalysts for Godzilla was the subject of the previous episode. Because RKO re-released the original King Kong from 1933 in 1952, and it performed exceptionally well, both in America and internationally, including in Japan. It demonstrated there was a large active audience for giant monster movies, and that the appetite hadn't dimmed in nearly 20 years. For Japanese producers, this signified that probably they should create their own monster. Tomoyuki Tanaka, the Toho producer who would shepherd Godzilla into existence, has cited the King Kong re-release as a direct influence on his thinking because it showed that a monster spectacle built around scale and destruction could be a major commercial proposition. And then a year later, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms was released in 1953. It was adapted loosely from a Ray Bradbury story and featured stop-motion effects by Ray Harryhausen. It was another significant hit, and it's arguably a more direct template for Godzilla in structural terms because it features a prehistoric creature awakened by nuclear testing in the Arctic, which then attacks a major city. But originally, Tanaka wasn't going to make Godzilla because he was involved in another production. In early 1954, Tanaka was producing a Japanese-Indonesian co-production called In the Shadow of Glory, but the project collapsed when the Indonesian government withdrew its cooperation over the casting of a Japanese director, as well as general Indonesian anti-Japanese sentiment. Tanaka was on a flight back to Tokyo from Jakarta with a significant budget commitment and nothing to fill it, and he needed a movie, and he needed it fast. The story goes that the idea for a giant monster movie came to him on that flight, drawing on everything that was already circulating in the culture and within his mind. The King Kong re-release, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and the Lucky Dragon incident, which, unlike King Kong and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, was a very real Japanese nuclear catastrophe that again wasn't of Japan's doing, but the United States. On the 1st of March 1954, the United States detonated a thermal-nuclear device at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands as part of Operation Castle Bravo, a series of high-yield thermonuclear weapon design tests. The yield was catastrophically larger than expected, approximately 15 megatons, roughly 2.5 times what they predicted, making it the most powerful American nuclear test ever conducted. The miscalculation meant the fallout radius was far larger than the exclusion zone the US had established. The Daigo Fukuryu Maru, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, was a Japanese tuna fishing vessel with a crew of 23, operating about 80 miles east of the Bikini Atoll. That placed them outside the declared danger zone, but well within the actual fallout radius, given the unexpected yield. The crew witnessed the detonation, an enormous flash followed by a shockwave, and then about 3 hours later, a fine white ash began falling on the ship. The crew called it Shi no Hai, ash of death. They didn't know what it was, but several men touched it and tasted it out of curiosity before realising what it was. But you didn't even need to touch it or taste it. The dust was everywhere. They breathed it in. It collected in their ears and eyes and in their clothing. The ash carried strontium-90, cesium-137 and uranium-237. The ship took about 2 weeks to return to its home port of Yaizu. By the time it docked, all 23 crew members were showing symptoms of acute radiation sickness. Nausea, bleeding gums, hair loss, skin lesions. Their cargo of tuna had also been irradiated. The effect on the Japanese public opinion was seismic. This was a nation that had survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki less than a decade earlier, had lived under American occupation for 7 years, and was now watching its fishermen come home poisoned by American nuclear testing in the Pacific. The sense of violation, of being again the victims of American nuclear power, was profound and widespread. It triggered a nationwide panic about contaminated fish and seafood. Tuna sales collapsed. There were fears about the broader Pacific fishing industry. The incident touched something very primal about food security and invisible contamination. The idea you couldn't see the danger, you couldn't taste it, you didn't know it was there until the damage was done. The US government's response made things considerably worse. American officials were slow to acknowledge the scale of what had happened and initially suggested the Lucky Dragon had been inside the exclusion zone, implying the crew bore some responsibility. This was untrue and deeply resented. There were also concerns, later substantiated, that American authorities were more interested in studying the crew's radiation exposure as medical data than treating them as victims deserving of straightforward humanitarian response. One crew member, the radio operator Eiichi Kubayama, died in September 1954, the same month Godzilla finished production. His death intensified the national grief around the incident. He's often described as the first Japanese victim of the hydrogen bomb, a framing that explicitly connected his fate to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Unfortunately, the Lucky Dragon No. 5 crew didn't qualify for the medical care benefits that the survivors of the atomic bomb were given, and many of them died early deaths, mostly of cirrhosis of the liver and, unsurprisingly, cancer, although they were compensated at the time with 2 million yen, which is a little over $50,000 in today's money. The opening sequence of Godzilla, a fishing vessel destroyed by a mysterious force at sea, the crew incinerated or irradiated, is a barely displaced version of the Lucky Dragon story. The white ash falling on the ship's deck becomes, in the movie, the radioactive wake of a monster. The connection was unmistakable to Japanese audiences at the time, and intentionally so. The incident also shaped the film's texture of dread, the idea of invisible contamination, of ordinary life suddenly and incomprehensibly poisoned, runs through Godzilla in a way that goes beyond simple monster movie plotting. It's why the film includes hospital scenes, Geiger counters and dying children. Ishirō Honda wanted audiences to feel the specific quality of nuclear fear, not just the spectacle of destruction. Godzilla was a way the Japanese nation could talk about their shared fears, grief and trauma without explicitly blaming the US for its wanton destruction. The Lucky Dragon incident became a significant catalyst for the international anti-nuclear movement. The incident sparked a growth of a significant and sustained anti-nuclear campaign that by August 1955 had collected 30 million signatures on a petition against nuclear weapons, which was institutionalised as the Japan Council Against Atomic and Hydrogen Bombs. It contributed directly to growing global pressure for a nuclear test ban treaty, which eventually produced the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. In Japan, it fed a pacifist and anti-nuclear sentiment that became deeply embedded in post-war political culture that Godzilla, arriving in the same year, both reflected and helped to shape. In 1954, the most expensive film ever made in Japan was produced and distributed by Toho. Directed and co-written by Akira Kurosawa, Seven Samurai was a huge hit in Japan and considered one of the greatest films ever made. And 1954 turned out to be a great year for Toho, not only giving the world one of the greatest movies ever made in Seven Samurai, but also creating a cultural touchstone, an icon of cinema, a character that 70 years later is still revered, respected and loved despite his turbulent cinematic history. The character of Gojira, or as he's known to the West, Godzilla. The primary forces behind 1954's Godzilla were special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya and director Ishirō Honda. Tsuburaya was a huge fan of Willis H. O'Brien, the animator of King Kong, and would go on to develop several of the techniques that would later become pillars of the kaiju genre and help forge the development and popularity of tokusatsu, featuring heavy practical effects, miniature sets of scaled-down cities and suitmation. Ishirō Honda completed his studies while working at the studio PCL, becoming an assistant director, which required him to be a scripter in the editing department. Honda eventually became a third assistant director on Satoji Kimura's The Elderly Commoner's Life Study in 1934, before being drafted into military service later that year. After completing his service, Honda returned home in December 1942, only to find that PCL, now rebranded as Toho, were forced to produce propaganda films to support the war effort. The government took control of the Japanese film industry in 1939, modelling the passage of motion picture laws after Nazi policies where scripts and films were reviewed, so they supported the war effort and non-compliant filmmakers were punished. Honda's experiences in the military would deepen his pacifist views, but the propaganda films he was forced to make needed special effects, which would link him to Eiji Tsuburaya. Producer Tomoyuki Tanaka conceived the idea for a giant monster film inspired by the 1953 film The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and the Lucky Dragon No. 5 incident while on the plane home after negotiations with the Indonesian government over the cancelled In the Shadow of Glory project. Tanaka wrote an outline with the working title The Giant Monster from 20,000 Miles Beneath the Sea and pitched it to executive producer Iwao Mori. Mori approved the project in mid-April 1954 after special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya agreed to do the film's effects and confirmed that the film was financially feasible. Mori also felt the project was perfect as a vehicle for Tsuburaya and to test the storyboarding system he created at the time. Mori also approved Tanaka's choice to have Ishirō Honda direct the film. Honda wasn't the first choice for director, but having been drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army and sent to the front lines of Japan's invasion of China, his wartime experience would make him an ideal candidate for the film's anti-nuclear themes. The title for the movie was shortened to Project G, G for giant, but it would eventually be named Gojira. The name Gojira was derived from the Japanese word for gorilla, gorira, and whale, Kujira. And so you put Gorira and Kujira together and you get Gojira. Eiji Tsuburaya had written his own story 3 years before Godzilla, which featured a giant octopus attacking ships in the Indian Ocean. Tanaka wanted something sci-fi horror and so hired novelist Shigeru Kayama to help refine this idea of a giant monster into an actual story. His treatment borrowed elements from films like The Lost World, King Kong, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and from his own 1952 short story Jira Monster, which featured a reptilian creature with hind legs terrorising primitive civilians and withstanding weaponry. Ishirō Honda read the sea creature story and had a specific direction he wanted to take the film. Honda, along with Takeo Murata, adapted the story into a screenplay that ultimately became Godzilla, written in 3 weeks and introducing the idea that the monster should serve as an allegory for nuclear testing. When it came to the design of the creature, Tanaka contemplated having the monster be gorilla-like or whale-like in design, but he eventually settled on a dinosaur-like design. Wasuki Abe was hired to design Godzilla, but his ideas were later rejected since Godzilla looked too humanoid and mammalian with a head shaped like a mushroom cloud. Tsuburaya originally wanted to use stop motion like Willis H. O'Brien for the film's special effects, but realised it would take 7 years to complete based on the current staff and infrastructure at Toho. Settling on suitmation and miniature effects, Tsuburaya and his crew scouted the locations that Godzilla was to destroy. Most of the miniatures were built at 1/25th scale, but the diet building was scaled down to a 1/33rd scale to look smaller than Godzilla. While they couldn't use stop motion to animate all of Godzilla, the final film does include a stop motion scene of Godzilla's tail destroying the Nishigeki Theatre building. The Godzilla suit was constructed by Kanju Yagi, Yasui Yagi and Aizo Kaimai, who used thin bamboo sticks and wire to build a frame for the interior of the suit and added metal mesh and cushioning over it to bolster its structure and apply coats of latex. Molten rubber was also applied, followed by carved indentations and strips of latex glued onto the surface of the suit to create Godzilla's scaly hide. The first version of the suit weighed 100 kilograms or 220 pounds. For close-ups, a smaller scale mechanical hand-operated puppet that sprayed streams of mist from its mouth to act as Godzilla's atomic breath was created. The building's frameworks were made of thin wooden boards reinforced with a mixture of plaster and white chalk. Explosives were installed inside miniatures that were to be destroyed by Godzilla's atomic breath. Some were sprayed with gasoline to make them burn more easily. Others included small cracks so they would crumble easily. Most of the electrical towers in the film were made of steel, but those that were to be melted by Godzilla's atomic breath were made of wax. The special effects crew melted the towers by blowing hot air on them, as well as shining hot studio lights on them for the white hot effect. Optical animation techniques were used for Godzilla's glowing dorsal fins by having hundreds of cells which were drawn frame by frame. In Godzilla's suit were Haruo Nakajima and Katsumi Tezuka. The suit was so heavy that the first version of the suit was cut in two and used for scenes requiring only partial shots of Godzilla or close-ups, with the lower half fitted with rope suspenders for Nakajima to wear. A second, slightly lighter suit was built for full body shots, but Nakajima could only spend 3 minutes in the suit before he would pass out. He lost 20 pounds during filming, just from the loss of bodily fluids. Inside the suit, it was 60 degrees Celsius, that's 150 degrees Fahrenheit, under hot studio lights. Nakajima would lose a cup of sweat every day. In fact, he perspired so much that the Yagi brothers had to dry out the cotton lining every morning and sometimes reline the interior of the suit and repair damages. Katsumi Tezuka would fill in for when Nakajima was unavailable. Cinematographer Masao Tamai had considerable influence on the film's look since he was one of Toho's top cinematographers, known for working with Mikio Narusi on several films. Narusi was considered a major figure in Japan's golden age of cinema. Tamai only accepted the job on Godzilla on the condition that the rest of Narusi's crew was hired along with him and he was given authority on the film's final look. For Godzilla's first appearance, there was supposed to be a bloody cow in his mouth, but after reviewing the test shots, Tamai felt it was far too graphic and had director Ishirō Honda cut the scene. The typhoon waves were created by stagehands who overturned barrels of water into a water tank where they'd built a miniature Odo Island shoreline. Toho hired en masse part-time employees to work on the film's optical effects. Half of the 400 hired staff were mostly part-time with little to no experience. Optical effects were utilised for Godzilla's footprints on the beach by painting them onto glass and inserting them into an area of the live-action footage. Special effects photography on Godzilla lasted for 71 days. When it came to the actual real person filming, On the first day, Honda addressed a crew of 30 to read the script and leave the project if they didn't feel convinced, because he only wanted to work with crew who had confidence in him and the film. They filmed on location in the Shima Peninsula in Mie Prefecture to film the Odo Island scenes, which used 50 Toho extras. Honda's team established their base in the town of Toba. Local villagers were also used as extras for the Odo Island scenes. The dance ritual scene was filmed on location in Mie Prefecture, with local villagers performing as the dancers. 2,000 girls were used from an all-girls high school for the Prayer for Peace scene. The cast and crew commuted every morning by boat to Toba and worked under harsh weather conditions, which included blistering sunburn. Wear sunscreen, kids. The troops going to the coast to face Godzilla were actual Japanese self-defense force troops. They were on manoeuvres when Honda shot the footage of them, but they refused to cooperate with the filming, and so much of the footage was World War II stock footage sourced from 16mm prints provided by the Japanese military. They also filmed at the Toho backlot, and 51 days of filming took place in the spring of 1954. It was Honda's idea to make Godzilla raw. Sound recorder Hisaishi Shimanaga and sound and musical effects Ishiro Manawa were originally tasked with creating the raw, but composer Akira Ifukube became involved after taking an interest in creating sound effects. Ifukube and Honda discussed what type of sounds were going to be used in certain scenes, and Minawa went to the zoo and recorded various animal roars and played them back at different speeds. But the sounds weren't good enough and they eventually went unused. So Ifukube borrowed a double bass from the Japan Art University's music department and created Godzilla's roar by loosening the strings and rubbing them with a leather glove. The sound was recorded and played at reduced speed, which achieved the effect of the roar used in the film. And this technique would be adopted by Toho as the standard method to create monster roars in the following years. Godzilla's footsteps were created using a primitive amplifier that made a loud clap when struck. And now a word from our sponsors, which is you, if you'd like to be. Thank you for listening to this podcast. It's completely independent, made by me, and relies on listener support. If you're enjoying this episode and the work that I do, and you want to support an indie podcaster, if you have some spare change, you can financially contribute to the upkeep of this podcast. You're under no obligation. This podcast is free and always will be, but there are a couple of ways you can help if you wish to and if you have the means to. You can make a one-off donation at verbaldiorama.com/tips, or you can subscribe to the Patreon to support the show monthly at verbaldiorama.com/Patreon. All money made goes back into this podcast by paying for software subscriptions, website hosting, and new equipment. Huge thank you for your continued support. Now let's learn some more about this movie and how Keanu Reeves is somehow connected to it. And I guess this is the best time to try and segue into the obligatory Keanu reference of this episode. And if you're new here and you don't know what this is, it's a part of the podcast where I try and link every episode that I feature with Keanu Reeves in some way. And just like last episode with King Kong, this is especially difficult because a movie of this age, Keanu Reeves wasn't around at this time. So it's very difficult to link him to this movie. However, I have found a way. Because Godzilla is the king of the monsters, as I'm going to come to. And Keanu Reeves is quite easily the king of the men, because he is the best of men, so therefore he is the king. Anyway, just going back to the music and the sound effects of Godzilla, because when Godzilla is rampaging, the actual music and sound effects were recorded live simultaneously. So while Ifukube conducted the NHK Philharmonic Orchestra, Foley artists watched Godzilla's rampage projected on a screen and used things like tin, concrete debris, wood and other equipment to simulate sounds that would sync with the footage. But the problem with that was a new take was needed if a Foley artist missed a cue. Many of Ifukube's themes and motifs associated with Godzilla were obviously introduced in this 1954 film, such as the march, the horror theme, and the requiem. the Self-Defense Force March has become so synonymous with Godzilla that Ifukube later referred to it as Godzilla's theme, and he considers his music for this film his finest film score. Now, even before Godzilla was released, there was a concerted marketing effort for the movie. 11 episodes of a radio play called Monster Godzilla, or Kaiju Gojira, were produced based on the screenplay and aired on Saturdays on the NHK radio network from the 17th of July to the 25th of September 1954 to promote the upcoming movie. But then Godzilla was a huge industry secret. Reporters were banned from the set and the special effects techniques were kept secret. But then also images of Godzilla were widely publicised on purpose. The theatrical trailer debuted in Japanese cinemas on the 20th of October 1954, 7 days before the movie released in Nagoya on the 27th of October 1954. So when Godzilla released nationwide on the 3rd of November 1954, it set a new opening day record for any Toho film by selling 33,000 tickets at Toho cinemas in Tokyo and selling out at Nishigeki Theatre. After the film's success in Japan in 1955, Manson International co-founder Edmund Goldman approached Toho about purchasing the rights to Godzilla, making Toho an offer of $25,000 for the theatrical and television rights, which they accepted. The contract stipulated that Toho and Goldman agreed that Godzilla would be narrated, dubbed in English, and completed by the revisions, additions and deletions, with final approval by Toho. And so this is where we get to a heavily altered version of the film, which was released in the US and worldwide as Godzilla, King of the Monsters, on the 25th of April 1956, featuring new footage with Canadian actor Raymond Burr interacting with body doubles mixed with Honda's footage to make it seem as if he's part of the original Japanese production. In this version, the overt references to the atom bomb and hydrogen bomb were omitted. Ishirō Honda was unaware that Godzilla had been re-edited until the American version was released in Japan as Monster King Godzilla in May 1957. Godzilla King of the Monsters was a huge success, grossing $2 million at the box office in the US, 4 times what Godzilla had made in its native Japan. It was the first Japanese feature to become a commercial success in the US and was at the time the 4th foreign film to have grossed more than $1 million at the American box office. While the 1954 film is credited for starting the franchise and establishing the template for tokusatsu filming, Godzilla King of the Monsters was responsible for introducing international audiences to the character of Godzilla. But for 50 years, Godzilla King of the Monsters was the only version available in the US. It took until 2004 for the Japanese original 1954 Godzilla to be made officially available in the United States. Previously, it was only available to cinemas catering specifically for a Japanese-American audience in predominantly Japanese neighbourhoods. To coincide with the film's 50th anniversary in 2004, art house distributor Rialto Pictures gave Godzilla a travelling tour-style limited release, coast to coast across the United States. It ran uncut with English subtitles for 7 months, playing in roughly 60 cinemas and cities across the US. In October 2005, the British Film Institute theatrically released the Japanese version in the UK. Godzilla had a budget of 62.9 million yen and earned 183 million yen in distributor rentals, which was a very healthy return. Attendance reached approximately 9.6 million viewers in Japan, which is a substantial figure for the period. While successful, it was somewhat smaller in scale relative to other major works of the same year, like Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, which alongside Godzilla has become one of Japan's most famous films. While we might see it as a huge critical success, Godzilla was met with mixed reviews upon release in Japan. Critical opinion at the time was divided. Some reviewers recognised its seriousness and craft, Others were dismissive of the monster movie format, regardless of what Honda was doing with it. There was also discomfort in some quarters about whether the film was exploiting national trauma rather than honouring it. It was the release of the American version, Godzilla King of the Monsters, that helped change the national sentiment. As the years passed, the opinion on Godzilla changed in Japan. It gained respect and admiration. Godzilla was nominated for 2 Japanese Movie Association Awards, one for Best Special Effects and the other for Best Film. It won Best Special Effects but lost Best Picture to Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. Kurosawa later listed Godzilla as one of his 100 favourite films. Godzilla spawned a multimedia franchise consisting of 38 films in total, video games, books, comics, toys and other media. The Godzilla franchise has been recognised by Guinness World Records as being the longest running film franchise in history. Since its debut, Godzilla became an international pop culture icon, inspiring countless rip-offs, imitations, parodies and tributes. The 1954 film and its special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya have been largely credited for establishing the template for tokusatsu, a technique of practical special effects filmmaking that would become essential in Japan's film and TV industry after the release of Godzilla. There are many eras of Godzilla. You have the Showa era from 1954 to 1975, which is the original Godzilla to Terror of Mechagodzilla. The Heisei era, 1984 to 1995, from The Return of Godzilla to Godzilla vs. Destroyer. The Millennium era, 1999 to 2004, which is Godzilla 2000, Millennium, to Godzilla Final Wars. And the Reiwa era, 2016 to present, starting with Shin Godzilla in 2016 through to Godzilla -1, the first Godzilla film to win an Academy Award in 2023. Godzilla returns in Godzilla -0 this year in 2026. And then you have the American releases, 1998's Godzilla and the MonsterVerse movies. Godzilla in 2014, Godzilla King of the Monsters in 2019, Godzilla vs. Kong in 2021, Godzilla X Kong The New Empire in 2026, and the forthcoming Godzilla X Kong Supernova in 2027. The general rule is that Japan and America can continue to produce new Godzillas, but never in the same year, which is why Godzilla -0 is this year and Godzilla X Kong Supernova is next year. Godzilla is now routinely placed among the most important Japanese films ever made, and its influence on genre cinema worldwide is incalculable. It dared to show mass destruction and disaster on a scale never before seen. Sure, King Kong ate a few people, but Godzilla destroyed ships and city blocks with ease. In 1954, audiences could have no clue they were watching something that would not only still be generating sequels, reboots and critical reassessments 70 years later, but literally create the kaiju genre and inspire countless other filmmakers. Steven Spielberg is probably the most prominent admirer. He described Godzilla as the most masterful of all the dinosaur movies because it made you believe it was really happening. The connection to Jurassic Park is obvious. Spielberg's admiration for the original film is documented in the making of book for Jurassic Park. Guillermo del Toro is another vocal admirer of Godzilla. He described his experience of the original film as producing a cumulative sense of oppression, war, dismay and hopelessness, and said that in the middle of it all there was a monster he fell in love with. He grew up in the 60s when the kaiju genre was at its peak and recalled that as a child he dreamed about giant robots when he had a fever. And that love culminated in Pacific Rim, which is also a previous episode of this podcast, in a previous kaiju. That is episode 213. Indeed, Pacific Rim is dedicated to Ishirō Honda and Ray Harryhausen, and he calls them the greatest giant monster creators in the history of cinema. But it's not just Spielberg and Del Toro. John Carpenter, Martin Scorsese and Tim Burton have all expressed admiration for the work of Ishirō Honda and the template he created for the disaster and monster film. For Christmas last year, my brother bought me the Criterion Collection Blu-ray of Godzilla 1954. And I'll be completely honest, I had never seen this movie before. This was my first time watching it. I actually watched the 1998 Godzilla first before I saw any Godzilla movie. So I saw the 1998 Godzilla before I saw this. And listen, that movie is fine. I actually quite enjoy it. But really, they are so not comparable. I enjoy the American MonsterVerse Godzillas, but again, they don't really feel anything quite like this. The closest comparison that I have seen is Shin Godzilla and Godzilla -1. Shin Godzilla I love because it reimagined the creature as a direct metaphor for governmental inefficiency in handling disasters, and also drew parallels to the 2011 Fukushima nuclear crisis. Plus it shows the raw monster of Godzilla, and Godzilla -1 because, like this movie, it speaks of the human story around this Godzilla attack, and it takes some skill to make us care about the humans in a Godzilla movie. And I really cared about the people. I cared about Dr. Yamane and his desire to study Godzilla, the only one of its species, and keep it alive and not kill it. I cared about Dr. Serizawa and his wish to not have a super weapon used, and for the only way for it never to get into the wrong hands is to use it and then taking his knowledge to the grave. And I cared about Emiko and Ogata and their plans to wed being totally derailed by the appearance of this monster, but also Emiko being the silent most important person in this movie, because she's the only one who knows about Serizawa's oxygen destroyer and chooses to tell his secret and betray him rather than let the world burn. Having a young Japanese woman basically be the hero of a movie in the 50s seems remarkably progressive, despite the fact she is still a woman and has to do the cooking and is left at home a lot of the time. And this is the thing with Godzilla. As a character, Godzilla constantly evolves. Each iteration is the same vessel of contemporary dread, and that's why the character has never become dated, because it's just the anxieties that are changing. Over 70 years, Godzilla has been transformed and morphed into something akin to a national mascot, which culminated in 2015 when Godzilla received a citizenship certificate from the Japanese government and was appointed as an official tourism ambassador. A creature born from trauma and designed to make audiences feel the horror of nuclear annihilation became, in time, a symbol of Japanese resilience, survival and cultural identity. For his 50th anniversary in 2004, he received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And of course, 70 years later, age is showing. The suitmation doesn't quite hold up like King Kong's stop-motion animation, but the feeling you get remains the same. The music is still perfection. The destruction feels relentless. We may be used to bigger monsters, but Godzilla, even in its most generic elements, is never just a monster movie. It's a deeply human story of survival, struggle, and raw emotion wrapped in a monster movie. Perhaps the most durable thing about Godzilla's legacy is that it demonstrated that a monster movie could be a serious work of art, that popular entertainment and genuine moral weight were not incompatible, that displacement into fantasy could be a form of truth-telling rather than an escape from it. Godzilla should not be seen as an artifact of its time, but as a generative node that continues to shape and be reshaped by Japan's cultural currents. And just like Dr. Yamane says, if nuclear weapon testing continues, another Godzilla may rise. So of course, he does. And he did. Because there were many sequels to this movie. But the fact that some countries still proudly show off their nuclear capabilities after the atrocities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the fact that we haven't, as a world, abolished atomic weapons, is a travesty in itself. And as long as countries continue to test and threat with nuclear weapons, as long as that threat persists, so does Godzilla as a warning to humanity. Maybe Godzilla isn't the monster. Maybe we are the monster. Thank you for listening. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on Godzilla, and thank you for your continued support of this podcast. You'll be back next episode to celebrate the United States of America's 250th birthday. That's right, it has been 250 years since America gained independence from us Brits. And I'm not throwing away my shot at this, because we never really knew a lot about the first Secretary of the Treasury and founding father Alexander Hamilton, his involvement in the American Revolution, or his personal life, until Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote the music, lyrics and book for the musical Hamilton, which premiered off-Broadway in 2015 and in 2020, during the heights of the pandemic, was released as a film on Disney Plus and became a smash hit phenomenon. And it really feels like the ideal time to talk about the movie version that's actually just a filmed version of 3 performances of the show. However, there is nothing more American and nothing better to celebrate the 250th birthday of America than talking about one of its founding fathers. So join me next episode for the history and legacy of Hamilton. Thank you for listening to Verbal Diorama, a totally free and independent podcast that relies on listener support. If you want to show your support in multiple different ways, you could leave a rating or review wherever you found this podcast. You could tell your friends and family about this podcast, or you could find me and follow me on social media and you can share the podcast that way. I am at Verbal Diorama across social media, where you can share posts, like posts, comment on posts. It all helps really to get the word out there, to hopefully get other people to know this podcast and know the recent episodes that I've put out. I genuinely love doing this podcast, and anything you could do to help would be so appreciated. A huge thank you to the incredibly generous patrons of this podcast. I could not do what I do without their support. To Simon, Laurel, Derek, Kat, Andy, Mike, Luke, Michael, Scott, Brendan, Ian, Lisa, Sam, Jack, Dave, Stuart, Nicholas, Zoe, Kev, Danny, Stu, Brett, Zenos, Sean, Rhino, Philip, Adam, Elaine, Aaron and Steve. Please consider joining them and supporting this podcast on Patreon if you have the means to. If you want to get in touch, you can email verbaldiorama@gmail.com. You can also go to verbaldiorama.com and you can fill out the contact form. You could say hello, you can give feedback, or you can give suggestions as well. I would genuinely love to hear from you. You can also DM me on social media as well, if that's an option available to you. I love to hear from people and I always try to respond as quickly as possible. Thanks again for listening, and thanks for supporting independent podcasting. It means more to us than you know. And finally, bye.